Well, good morning, everybody. Pilar, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a huge pleasure to be here and speaking to you this morning. This is such a lovely event, and at heart, I'm very much a practitioner and a technical engineer, and it's lovely to be at an event that really focuses and celebrates that aspect of what we do. So I'm hugely grateful for the invitation to be here with you today, and delighted to be speaking to you. So today I'm going to speak about the evolution of the structural Eurocodes. It has been one of the largest programs of standardization activity in European history, and I've had the privilege of leading this effort for the last 12 years, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share with you a little bit of what we have been doing and the focus for our efforts, to share with you the latest status, and to talk to you a little bit about what comes next and share with you some of my thoughts about the transition towards implementation. So, as I said, we are in the process of transitioning from the first generation of the EN Eurocodes to the second generation, and this has been an effort that has spanned many years. It started at a European level really back in 2012 properly. So it's been a long effort, and we've recently achieved a number of significant milestones as we approach the publication of all of the second generation Eurocodes and then the transition to their implementation, and I will talk you through this today. I always think when I'm listening to someone speak, if they are sharing some of their views with me, I'm always interested in their viewpoint. And I thought I would start off by just explaining a little bit of my background. So my core role, my day job is as a practitioner. I'm now the managing director for WSP's Civil Intelligent Infrastructure and Roads units in the UK. My background is very much in bridge engineering, and WSP's UK bridge engineering capability has been, I guess, part of what I've worked on for the last 30 years to build up that capability, and I now have around 600 colleagues that specialize in bridge engineering in the UK business alone, and WSP has almost 3,000 bridge engineering specialists around the world, so it's an extraordinary platform to work from. But I combine that role with, as Pilar explained, my role in chairing TC250, the committee that is responsible for the Eurocodes, which I've done now for a little over 12 years. But I do combine that with a number of other things. So I'm currently the Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, which again is a very, very privileged role. A visiting professor at the University of Bath, which gives me the opportunity to engage in some teaching and research activities. And for many years now, I have served as an advisor to clients and to governments. And through that, I guess the combination of all of those things, I bring all of those different perspectives into the work on standardization. Although, as I started saying at the very beginning, at heart, I'm a practitioner. My favorite thing is working on projects and being engaged, as I'm sure is the same for most of us, engaged in the delivery of exciting projects. So what I'm going to do today is I've split this talk into 5 parts. I'm going to start talking about why I feel design standards matter, why they're so important. I then want to share with you the objectives for the evolution of the Eurocodes, and then talk a little bit about the background, the approach we've taken over the last 12 years or so, and summarize the current status of the second generation documents. Then I wanted to share with you a little bit about enabling the transition to the implementation of the second generation Eurocodes, and I'll share with you a few perspectives from the UK and what's happening in the UK, which I hope may be of interest, and then finally some brief conclusions. So let me start off with that discussion of why design standards matter. And I think that I have the best job in the world. I really do. I get to work on the most extraordinary projects, and I'll come back and talk about this one a little bit later, where I have the privilege of working between multiple countries on extraordinary projects. And you can imagine that from a bridge engineering perspective, having 600 colleagues within the part of the business that I'm responsible for who focus on bridge engineering, we do an enormous number of projects. And one of the great privileges of leading a unit of that scale is I kind of get to choose which projects I work on. And that's a very, very privileged position. And given that privileged position, you might well ask, why do I spend so much time working on standards? Because there are all these amazing other projects to work on. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about why I think standards are so important and why I have spent so much time over the years working on the development of standards. And the first of those reasons is about the impact of standards. So when the Eurocodes were first introduced, the first generation, the European Commission did an assessment of the impact of the Eurocodes, and they determined that the Eurocodes would be used by around 500,000 engineers across Europe, and are now, of course, used by many other engineers around the world as well. And how often do we get the opportunity to do something that has that kind of professional impact? It's a hugely exciting thing to be working on something which has that kind of profound impact, that impacts directly construction activities that make up 7 or 8% of GDP across Europe. It's a profoundly impactful activity, but I think for me, what I also really value with the work on the Eurocodes is I think it creates a common bond, a common language that we can use as engineers across Europe and elsewhere around the world. And so the impact is both on our day-to-day activities, but also in locking opportunities for us to work more collaboratively internationally. The second reason why I think standards are so important comes down to one of the key characteristics of our sector, of the construction sector. And that is that the scale of the projects that we undertake means that it's simply impractical for us to test our designs before they are built. When you think about it, in most other branches of engineering, designs are tested in labs and factories as products before they're put onto the market. We don't have the opportunity to do that in our sector. In our sector, we need a means by which we can verify the adequacy of our designs before they are built. And that is a fundamental role of design standards. Another key characteristic of our sector is that it is quite fragmented. We have lots of different organizations that are involved in the complete life cycle of construction assets, constructed assets, from the initial conceptual design through detailed design, construction, ongoing maintenance and management of assets. It's a highly, highly fragmented sector with many, many different parties involved. And one of the characteristics of a highly fragmented sector is it's very difficult to learn lessons. When you contrast what we do with maybe automotive, where you have companies that have line of sight from conceptual design right through to the maintenance of the vehicles that we drive, that lessons can be learned much more easily in that situation. But for us, in the construction sector, that fragmentation that we have means it's difficult to learn lessons. Standards play a key role in enabling us to learn lessons. And we know this is true because when there have been major incidents, major lessons learned within our sector, it's often been a stimulus for a period of heightened activity in the development of standards, just demonstrating that standards play this key role in enabling us to learn from the past and build that learning in the way we work in the future. Similarly, standards provide a very, very powerful vehicle for us to embrace new societal demands. And in the case of the Eurocodes, I guess particularly at the forefront of our thinking has been how we can enable better sustainability, how we address the challenges of climate change, how we can enable carbon reduction within designs. All of those kind of challenges have been in our minds as we've been working on the development of the Eurocodes. Not always explicitly, because the Eurocodes, of course, are design standards. They are there to enable us to verify the safety, serviceability, robustness, and durability of our designs. But what's key is having content within those standards that enable us to design efficient structures that minimize material use the latest technologies for analysis, for example, and use new materials that enable us to reduce the carbon intensity of what we do. Those are the kind of things that the second generation of the Eurocodes enables. And then finally, as a vehicle for research to translate into application. You know, when I was doing my PhD, I remember going to conferences, and this was back in the 90s, and what you would hear would be presentations where people would talk about the research they were doing, which was really interesting, but they would contextualize it in relation to their national standards. And it became quite difficult then to understand how that could be used more broadly than within the context that that research had been undertaken. You know, the Eurocodes have provided a platform that means that research can be set in the context of the Eurocodes, and its application, if it is of a sufficient level of maturity to make it into the Eurocodes, then enables really extensive use. You know, and of course, what is the point of research? The point of research is to enable innovation and new approaches. And we do that because we want to enable change. And if we want to enable change successfully, then we want to enable change at scale. And what better way to enable change at scale than for the research to find its way into standards ultimately? So for all of those reasons, I think that standards are really important. And as well as thoroughly enjoying the time I spend working on standardization activities, I always have inside me this sense that what we are doing in this standardization work is really important work. So let me move on and just talk a little bit about the objectives for the evolution of the Eurocodes. So this is a huge program. And as with any huge program, I think it's really important that you embark upon a program like that with a clear sense of what are your overarching aims. And when I took over the responsibility for TC250, one of the things I did early on was to try to make sure that we had a clear consensus on what mattered most to us as CEN TC250. And we agreed two overarching aims for the evolution of the Eurocodes. The first is that we would work to enhance the ease of use of the standards. And the second is that we would seek to achieve exemplary levels of international consensus. And I'm going to take a few minutes now just to add a little bit of detail to each one of those. So in terms of enhancing ease of use, again, one of the first things that I did when I became chair was to establish a panel of 16 experts from across Europe. What we then did was undertook consultation across 34 countries across Europe to seek people's views on what it meant to try to achieve enhanced ease of use. You know, at the time, there was quite a lot of discussion about simplification. And we quite deliberately moved from a conversation about simplification to a conversation about ease of use. Simplification can sometimes imply a dumbing down, you know, but as engineers, we know that some of the projects that we deal with, some of the things we deal with, are inherently complicated. The projects that you're speaking about and hearing about at this conference, amazing projects that have inherent complexity. We shouldn't, as professional engineers, shy away from that. But that isn't a reason why our standards need to be any more complicated than they need to be. And so we agreed this focus around ease of use, of user orientation, and this panel set out and defined what that meant to us. And ultimately their recommendations were endorsed by the 34 countries, the 34 members of CEN, who are the focus of the activity on the development of the Eurocodes. And we developed this vision, this focus. It was very clear that we were going to focus on creating more user-orientated standards. But really significantly, there was an emphasis not just on that we wanted to do it, but how we were going to do it. And we built that methodology around 5 pillars, setting out statements of intent for how we would seek to meet users' needs, setting out a series of principles and priorities, creating examples, some measurements, and putting in place the management governance and support to enable these. And again, one of the very early steps was to recognize that because we were going to have thousands of experts from across Europe engaged in this project, that it was really important that we all had a common understanding for who the primary target audience for the Eurocodes is. And it's because you could imagine that different people would have slightly different perspectives, and bringing those different perspectives into the drafting could create different tones, different approaches in different documents, and we wanted to avoid that. So we wanted to be very, very clear who our primary audience was. And so we agreed from the outset that everyone involved in the development of the Eurocodes should have in their mind our primary audience of what we said, practitioners, competent engineers, competent civil, structural and geotechnical engineers, typically qualified professionals, but then able to work independently in relevant fields. And I'm sure that your experience will be similar to mine, that when we recruit engineers from university and for the first few years they're learning and they reach a point, maybe after 3, 4, 5 years experience, where we have the confidence that they can work much more independently. That's the point that we're really focusing on in terms of the primary target audience for the Eurocodes. But we recognize that there are many other user groups for the Eurocodes. So what we also set out was a series of what we called statements of intent. What are we going to try to achieve with the evolution of the Eurocodes for all of the different user communities? So for our primary target audience, we set the ambition that we'd aim to produce standards that are suitable and clear for all common design cases without demanding disproportionate levels of effort to apply them. So that was our focus, but you can see that we set out for all of the different other user groups, and there's a whole another page of these, what our aims would be. So for national regulators to produce standards that can be referenced or quoted in national regulations, clearly really important. For educators to have common underlying principles, for software developers to make sure that we provide unambiguous and complete design procedures so that they can be implemented within software. And actually, if we go back to, say expert specialists, aiming not to restrict the ability of experts to apply their expertise, to innovate. And in that case, there are some very practical things that you can do when you're developing standards. And one of the key things that you can do when you're developing standards to meet that statement of intent for expert specialists lies actually in the way in which you express the provisions within the standard. So we spent a lot of time early on focusing on the verb forms that are used within the standard. And we've actually, again, in the second generation Eurocodes, and we didn't have it previously, in the second generation of Eurocodes, in the Eurocodes itself, we explain our drafting intent behind the verb forms that are used. So you can look in the Eurocode itself and it spells this out, so that it should eliminate ambiguity about what we mean when we say shall, and what we mean when we say should, and what we mean when we say may, what we mean when we say can. And we spent, I think, some of my colleagues on TC250 probably found it a little bit relentless that we spent so much time talking about this and how important it was. I have a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old son at home. I suspect they were the only children in their class who really understood the difference between the proper use of the words may and can. Colloquially, we use it very differently. But it's so important. It's so important when we're developing standards that you have that clarity, and that discipline around the use of language is important. And on the right-hand side, I've just got a figure taken from the core content of EN 1992. So the second generation Eurocode for concrete structures, and that gives the split between the number of requirements, of recommendations, should clauses, and permissions. And what you see is that we've sought to keep the core requirements, the things that you have to do, that you cannot deviate from, keep them around a quarter of the provisions. But for everything else, there is a degree more flexibility, and for the may provisions, a significant degree of flexibility. And that's fundamental to meeting that objective, that statement of intent for experts. And then just continuing through briefly, In terms of that second pillar, the principles and priorities, you'll see right at the top a focus around clarity and understandability, the second of ease of navigation. And look, ultimately, you'll be the judge of how well we've done. You'll be the judge of how well we've done. But what I wanted to share with you is at least to understand what our ambition was and how we've sought to achieve these things, I think is really important. And in terms of the other pillars, we actually introduced a host of new innovations into the standardization process. It is rare to do a program on this scale. The funding that we received from the European Commission to support the evolution of the Eurocodes was the largest standardization grant ever in European standardization history by a significant margin, by a very significant margin. And because of that scale of what we were doing and looking to embody a clear programmatic approach, we did introduce a number of innovations. The appointment of a technical reviewer to look across all of the Eurocode suites, all of the Eurocode documents in the suite, to try and drive consistently, extensive review of deliverables, guidance documents produced, lots of examples and advice. Because what we absolutely recognized is that whilst when you're writing a standard, you tend to be very much focused on a particular clause or section of a standard, when you use a standard, you use the suite. And so consistency across the suite is really, really important. The second objective, and I'll cover this one really briefly, is around achieving exemplary levels of international consensus. And one with this, we set out, and it was kind of interesting amongst the technical committee to spend time talking about how are we going to get to a consensus position? You know, how are we going to find a place of agreement? And we actually spelt out and agreed, and unanimously agreed across all of the CEN members, how we should approach this. And, you know, consensus is such a, you know, for me, I suppose, in many ways, the work that I've done over the last 12 years in chairing TC250 has been a journey for me around that process of how to build consensus and the importance and the power of consensus building. You know, and let's understand what consensus is. You know, consensus is reaching a point where not necessarily has everyone got their first preference of a position, but you reach a destination that everyone can stand behind and support. You know, and I think it's a really profoundly important concept. I've spoken to many rooms of people about this over the years, and I've done experiments where I've asked people to talk to or to score out of 10 how the word consensus feels to them and how the word compromise feels to them. And you know, when I ask them those questions and I ask them to score them, and what I generally find is people value consensus, you know, instinctively. They see consensus as a better thing than compromise, generally by about +2 if you actually did the maths. What does that tell me? I mean, what that tells me is that what is actually happening as we build consensus is a kind of trade, that it's inherent if people are not ending up with their initial preferences, that they are to an extent compromising. But what they're willing to do through a process of building consensus is to accept that they may not have their initial preference, but they value the power of having a common position that everyone can stand behind. And I think that's a really, really profoundly important concept. And so we've worked really hard on this. And I did also want to share with you, I was doing an interview recently, and the person interviewing me asked me, they knew that I'd been doing the work on the Eurocodes and other things where it was major consensus building processes, and they said to me, so how do you deal with disagreements? And I think when they asked me that question, and probably when I relayed that question to you, our instinct is to think of disagreements as being a bad thing. But actually, in reality, how do we ever progress anything if we don't recognize and embrace that people will have different views? You know, that's why when we build teams for projects, we build teams within companies, we build teams more broadly, actually what you want is diversity of opinion, because diversity of opinion gives us fresh insights. It helps us get to better places. And so actually in the process that we set out for trying to build consensus across TC250, the first step is to recognize that if there is some kind of disagreement or issue identified, we shouldn't hide away from it, we should embrace it. We need to recognize that it exists. It's a positive thing that it is there. And in my experience, many, many times over, the reason why people disagree with one another is very, very rarely that they are answering the same question differently. It is almost always that they're answering different questions, but not realizing they're doing so. And so taking the time to understand different perspectives helps us unlock the root causes for the differences of view and then navigate a path that addresses everyone's concerns. And that gets you to a much, much better place. And what's this look like? Since I took on the chairmanship of TC250, we've taken over 500 formal decisions where every country gets to vote. And over 98% of those have been unanimous decisions. And in fact, on the formal vote, the final formal voting process for the second generation Eurocodes, 33 of those concluded so far. But of all of the votes that could have been cast by the 34 countries, fewer than 0.5 of 1% of votes have been negative. You know, so that huge effort, that huge effort to build that consensus, I think we're really seeing the dividends of that. So let me then walk you through quickly the background, the approach, current status for the second generation Eurocodes. So in terms of background, the structure of the second generation Eurocodes looks similar to the first generation Eurocodes, but the scope is extended. New coverage of structural glass, of fiber polymer composites, and of tension membrane structures. The organization for the delivery of this huge program at TC250 means that we have got subcommittees that are responsible for each of the different Eurocode parts. And then we have a number of horizontal groups that coordinate and try to ensure that we've got consistency across the Eurocode suite as well. It's always important when you talk about the Eurocodes to recognize that the Eurocodes are the design standards, fundamental suite of standards, but they sit within a wider family of standards for construction across Europe. So it's been crucial that the Eurocodes align well and better with European product standards and execution standards as well. This has been a major focus for us as well through the last decade and more. We then have the national annexes and complementary and supporting information developed at a national level, becoming an increasing focus, and I'll come on to talk about that. But then all of the supporting materials around client implementation and requirements. I know Pilar spoke yesterday about some of the fantastic work that's been going on in Spain on that front, and then wider support to the profession. And I saw that, ACE as an organization has held a number of workshops, produced a number of documents, again, supporting the profession with this transition and to take advantage of the content within the second generation Eurocode. So you see, it is always important to see it as an overall system. In terms of the evolution process, a key milestone back in 2012 was receiving the mandate M515 from the European Commission. They're not called mandates anymore, they're now called standardization requests from the Commission, and it's a much better term. It is a request for standards to be developed, and it sets out strategic aspirations from the Commission and unlocks the potential for funding and support. That was really important to us, and the support that we've received from the European Commission has been vital to the evolution program. But we responded to that with around 1,000 experts across Europe came together to develop our response to that mandate, develop the plan for how we would evolve the Eurocode, and that plan has provided the basis for all of the work that we've done over the last 12 years. But importantly also, that the way in which this work has been done was to respond to the strategic ambitions within Mandate M515, which we supported and agreed. But also, we went out to every one of the 34 countries on every one of the existing Eurocodes and asked for clause-by-clause comment on how the Eurocodes could be improved. This was a huge exercise. We collected thousands and thousands of comments, of suggestions for how the Eurocodes could be improved, and we catalogued every single one of those comments. We responded to every single one of those comments, and every single one of those comments then fed through to the evolution program. So this effort has been both embraced the strategic intent, but also the detailed feedback that we received and the lessons learned from the first generation documents. And I've already shown you this, but you can see that we're now getting right to the far end of the program. So the work on the evolution activities themselves, we did through 4 phases. We established project teams to lead that work. I know there are people in the audience that were engaged in some of those project teams, 4 phases of activity. So a huge program. And in terms of a few headlines of the scale of what we're doing, so TC250 itself, it currently has, last time I counted, it may have a couple more now, but last time I counted, which was a few months ago, had 129 active subcommittees, working groups, and task groups. It's a huge family of experts across Europe working on this program. I talked about the importance of alignment with product standards, execution standards. We've got 46 active liaisons across the other technical committees to try and make sure that all of that is joined up. We formed those 76 European-funded international project teams through 4 phases of open competition, seeking to get the best experts from across Europe engaged in this effort, and also to bring new people into the work as well was one of our ambitions. The SEN standardization process involves, there's requirements to have processes of inquiry and formal vote where we seek comments on drafts, but we went way beyond that. We have created over 300 opportunities for national standards bodies through the opinions of their mirror committees to feed back comment on the developing drafts of the Eurocodes. And so much of this work, as you can imagine, was at a really critical point when COVID hit us. And despite that, we delivered all of that European Commission funded work on budget, on program, with no queries either on any of the technical content or also on any of the commercial and financial and procedural content as well. And we did that despite COVID with thousands of experts involved in this work. You know, when I've done the calculation, I think that at a European level, those 129 active groups probably have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 experts involved in that activity at a European level. And when you think that across those 34 countries, there are mirror committees feeding into that activity, that I think there's probably somewhere between 10 and 15,000 experts who have contributed to this effort. So it's just the most magnificent collaborative European effort to develop these standards. And what are we going to see in terms of the key changes? So we'll see changes of scope and bringing up to date across the whole suite of the existing standards, extension of scope to cover structural glass, fiber polymer composites, and tension membrane structures. We've been monitoring the length of the standards. One of the pieces of feedback we had was that it was a desire not to see the length of the standards just get longer and longer and longer. Now, what you will see when you look at the new Eurocodes is because of their new scope, they've got longer. But we've looked on a like-for-like basis of the content in the length of the content in the second generation versus the content in the first generation standards. We're monitoring that, and it's about 10% shorter. Okay, so we've shrunk what we had originally. It's got a little longer because we've got new scope inevitably, but we have had that focus. There are common cross-cutting things that we've looked at. The assessment of existing structures, a massively important part of what we do as engineers. One of the biggest contributions that we can make to sustainability and to the climate crisis and decarbonization is to work to extend the life of existing structures. One of the most important contributions that we can make. And for that reason, And because it's such a fundamental part of what we do in dealing with aging infrastructure, the assessment of existing structures is now covered partially and increasingly within the scope of the Eurocodes. And specific coverage, as I mentioned before, on for example, climate change. So the second generation Eurocodes will require designers to take account of climate change in, for example, the evaluation of environmental actions. And I think that's just a really positive step that 34 countries have said, in future when we are designing structures, we shall take account of climate change. We shall design long life assets, not just for the climatic conditions they'll experience at the start of their life, but considering the climatic conditions that they will experience later in their life. And of course, what we've also sought to do is to provide clauses within the standards that mean that that doesn't need to be burdensome for designers. It's relatively simple means by which those are taken into account, but just really important that that principle's embraced. And actually one of the other changes that I wanted to talk about, and you won't see this when you look at the Eurocodes, but actually one of the other really important changes is that with the first generation documents, essentially they were released to national standards bodies as kind of PDFs. Basically they were electronic versions of paper documents fundamentally. The second generation of Eurocodes are being released to the national standards bodies both in that form but also in XML format. And by producing them in XML format, it unlocks all sorts of possibilities for a real transformation in the way in which we use standards in the future. And that's something which I think is both important and inevitable. And the fact that we're releasing the standards to national standards bodies in this format, as I said, is a really important step in unlocking the potential for us to be able to use standards, not, if you like, as a reference document, but as a hub, a digital hub, that can then take us off to other guidance materials, educational resources, that we can integrate them within the analysis work packages that we're using. There's just so much potential there to do things differently in the future. I think it's really important change. And that change is only possible if the standards themselves are available in a digital format that enables that. And that we have done at a SEN level. How that plays out over the next few years, I don't know. But I think that we have done our part in making the documents available to the national standardization bodies in a manner which enables that change. So where do we sit today? So the second generation Eurocodes, there'll be 11 standards, 65 parts. There'll be 12 supporting SEN technical specifications, those are voluntary standards, 7 supporting SEN technical reports. They provide the background and guidance material on the implementation of standards. Where we are today, 33 of those Eurocode parts have been positively voted and have been made available to the national standards bodies, and all of the remaining Eurocode parts are on schedule. And we actually made a very, very bold decision about 5 or 6 years ago that we would commit to a schedule for delivering the Eurocodes. You could imagine that when you have got that many people involved in a project, many of whom are working on a voluntary basis, to commit yourself to an end date and say we will hit this, is quite a bold step. We know from experience the kind of projects we work on, sometimes deadlines are challenging. Setting a deadline for that kind of project 5 years in advance was a really bold step, but it was essential, because if we didn't set that deadline, then we would create ambiguity for national regulators and others to be able to plan their transition. So we needed to set a deadline. We set a deadline. We said that all of the second generation Eurocodes would be available by March 2026. In order to achieve that, we needed the final round of voting on those documents to happen this October. And to achieve that, we needed to issue all of the drafts to the SEN Management Center to do the editorial and translation activities by May, and we hit that May deadline. So we are on track to hit this March 26 deadline for having all of the second generation documents available. So what does this look like in terms of the transition? And this is the final section of the presentation. So I do need to just explain a couple of terms to you. So I've talked about making standards available or releasing standards to national standards bodies in kind of SEN language. That's called the date of availability. And then there's another key date, which is what's referred to as the date of withdrawal. And the date of withdrawal, as you can see here, is defined as the latest date by which national standards conflicting with an EN standard have to be withdrawn. And the date of withdrawal, if you like, is a property of the new standard, but it applies to the old standard. I hope that makes sense. So you state a date of withdrawal in the new document, but it's not the withdrawal of that new document it applies to, it's saying the dates when the old documents have to be withdrawn by. Okay? And we agreed as a special derogation for the Eurocodes, a common date of withdrawal, common target end date for availability, and said we're holding to all of the stuff on the left-hand side of the screen. The critical thing here, the critical thing to understand is that all of the second-generation Eurocodes should be made available to the national standards bodies by May 2026, and then by March 26, and then by March 2028, there's a requirement to withdraw the conflicting standards, and the conflicting standards are the first generation Eurocodes. Yeah. So that what we're going to move into through 26, 27 and into 28 is that transition to that date where the expectation is that by March 2028, across the whole of Europe, the first generation standards will have been withdrawn by that backstop date, and the second generation standards will be the ones that are in use. So in terms of national implementation, what needs to happen? One of the key things that needs to happen is the development of national annexes, and I thought I'd just share with you just briefly a little bit of what's going on in the UK, just by illustration. So in the UK, BSI, the national standards body for the UK, has a very extensive structure of mirror committees with extensive participation from industry, and at the moment the principal activity of those committees is working on the national annex development. And I thought it might be interesting just to share, I got a list of the bodies that are represented on those committees, and that's not all of them, but that's the key ones. You know, these are all in the UK, all of those organizations, some client organizations, some asset owning organizations, regulatory bodies, industry bodies, professional bodies, all represented in this activity, and lots of experts either representing these groups or as appointed experts, all engaged in this effort. And again, in the UK, we've developed a host of guidelines around how we develop the national annexes, tracking the development of the national annexes. It's a significant project. And I know that this is happening elsewhere across Europe, slightly different flavor in different countries. I know it'll be happening here as well. But I thought it might just be interesting to you just to get a little bit of insight into the way in which we're tackling this within the UK. And then just some closing comments in terms of further information. So if you are interested in further information around the Eurocode transition, the best place to go is for the European level information is to the JRC, the European Commission's Joint Research Centre website. So all you need to do is just Google Eurocodes and JRC, and you'll get to this website, and there's a load of technical background, lots and lots of presentations. There's a video series that talks about the whole approach that we've taken. That video series, if you have colleagues that would be interested, unfortunately, my Spanish isn't great, so they're in English, but they're all subtitled, so you can just click subtitles, any European language, subtitled. So those are there, plus lots of other technical content that's available. And I did start by talking about my background, and I guess mostly this morning I've been talking about my role as chair of TC250, but I just wanted to return just with one example, which is kind of closer to home in terms of my day job and my work within WSP. And I talked about the fact that I have the opportunity to work on fantastic projects. And one of the projects that I've been working on is the independent check, the third-party check of the Femen fixed link, what will be the longest immersed tube tunnel in the world, running between Germany and Denmark. And Pilar and I were talking around the Eurocodes and the benefits of them and the kind of opportunities that they unlock. And for me, I thought this is such a lovely exemplar project, because on this project, you could imagine that it is a project that goes between two countries. So if you didn't have common standards, whose standards would you use? So there is something really useful about the fact that you have the common standards that are used, the first generation documents, obviously, because it's a live project. But also from a WSP point of view, we're leading the independent check from the UK, but we're doing it using a team of experts from the UK and Spain. So my colleague Jose Manuel and his team in Santander are working with my colleagues across the UK together. We can do that conveniently using the Eurocodes, because we all understand the common basis, into a project which is spanning Germany to Denmark, and the fact that we can do that quickly, we can access expertise, we have a common language, would just not be possible if we didn't have these common standards, which, as I talked about early on in terms of the objective, one of those statements of intent was around reducing barriers to trade, providing opportunity for expertise to be both imported and exported, and this is a lovely project example of that. So with that, let me just run to a few quick conclusions. So look, I hope that that's been interesting for you. A quick summary. The publication of the second generation Eurocodes is nearing its conclusion. It'll be only a matter of months before all of the second generation Eurocodes are available. Those new Eurocodes are technically up to date, they have extended scope, and as hopefully you'll take away from this presentation, we've invested huge efforts in trying to enhance ease of use. Now, ultimately, you'll be the judge on how well we've done, but what I want you to take away from this room is an understanding that that has been central to the effort that we've invested in this. The focus is now shifting. The last decade, the work has been at a European level. It now moves to being at a national level. It's now about the national implementation. And so, again, it was great to know that you had the session yesterday, the work that's already ongoing within Spain. And I would just, to conclude, say that for me, the work that I've done over the last decade and more, it's been a huge privilege, but also a huge pleasure. And it's been so lovely to be here at this event and meeting friends that I've made through the work that I've done on standardization. I think it creates a wonderful community, and so I thoroughly enjoy what I've done, and that's why I would encourage you again to engage in the transition, engage in this activity, because I think that what we do around standardization, for the reasons I set out at the start, is really, really important to our sector. And with that, let me just thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you.